Good afternoon. Welcome to the Glendale Water and Power Commission meeting. Today's date is April 7, 2014. President Hugh Yao will not be attending this meeting, and I'm filling in for him. Can we please have roll call?
And for the record, also Commissioner Ajemian is going to be absent as well. Commissioner Camargo?
Here.
Commissioner Chan?
Present.
Commissioner Hale?
Here.
Next item, please.
Two consent items. A, approval of the February 6, 2014 special meeting minutes.
If there are no changes, suggestions, I move to approve the minutes for February. No?
Okay.
Okay.
2B, approval of the March 3, 2014 meeting minutes.
I don't believe I was here. So,
If I was here, I have no comments on them.
no comments? No?
Without objection.
Okay. We'll go ahead and approve those as well. Next item, please.
3, GWP Commission staff comments.
Madam President Pro Tem, we have no comments from staff.
Okay. I was not here last month. Do we have any comments from the other two commissioners? Okay, I understand we're going to have some update on the water supply and drought, so I'm really interested in that. So we'll move on. Next item.
4, reports, information. A, water supply and drought preparation update.
Madam President Pro Tem, I introduce to you Atine Hartunian, who's going to give you an update. She's going to give you the latest and greatest that we have, although our timing's a little bit off because she's going to be attending some important MWD meetings this week that are going to shed a lot more light on things from the perspective of response to drought and some of the drought programs. But we'll bring that back to you the next time we meet and give you an update on that as well.
Okay, great.
Thank you. Members of Commission, hello, my name is Atine Hartunian and I'm the Public Benefits Coordinator for Glendale Water and Power. I'm here to give you an update about our water conservation outreach efforts. Just to inform you, the water supply situation in California hasn't greatly improved, and like Steve said, I'll be back next month to give you a more detailed update about the supply information. However, we are still in voluntary conservation mode and are encouraging our residents and all Californians to conserve 20%. We have definitely stepped up our conservation messaging in the last few months, and I wanted to give you a brief update on our outreach activities and what we have coming up. I've provided you with packets that have all the information that we are distributing to our customers in different ways, and I'll go into more detail about that. The packet you currently have includes a shower timer, children's activity books, water conservation pamphlets and information, bill inserts, and informational flyers. All residents can also view all of this information and more information on water conservation on our website, GlendaleWaterandPower.com, and we also post weekly messages on our social media platforms such as Twitter and Facebook. In addition to this, since January, we have distributed about 600 shower timers to customers, 500 water booklets, 600 water tips and saving brochures, over 85,000 bill inserts to how to check for water leaks in your home, and over 500 children's coloring books and activity books. We have been to 4 community events where we promoted our water conservation and spoke to residents about the governor's drought declaration and what it means to them and what they could do to conserve and what it means for our future water supplies. We are currently working on 2 printed advertising pieces. One is through the Chamber of Commerce and the other is through I Love My Neighborhood Cleanup Project. They have an ad book and we're going to take ads in that. We are also promoting water conservation through GTV Channel 6. We have water conservation slides that are showing conservation tips and information, and we're also working with them on developing a water conservation public service announcement, which will be selling that or buying spots on cable television and in different languages. We are also looking into advertising in local media such as newspapers, bus shelters, and Beeline advertising. We have 2 community meetings scheduled to discuss water conservation. One is to the next door neighborhood community group, and the second one is to the Women's Realtors Association. And the third one we actually have coming up is to the Glendale Realtors Association. They've also asked us to come and present on water conservation. Other ways we are promoting our conservation is through GWP bills, which include water conservation bill messaging, messaging on the inside as well as a water conservation message on the outside of the envelope. Our GWP Community Bulletin Board, which is across from our bill pay window, also displays water conservation information. Each letter that goes out to our customers from GWP displays a standard water conservation message at the bottom. Our water conservation information is also mentioned in the city's monthly newsletter and GWP's bi-monthly newsletter. We are currently working on a brochure that I'll show you just a second. If you look inside your packets, this is a tip. It's a very actually helpful brochure that includes different tips, and we're using the same icons that the state is using in their Save Our H2O website. We actually asked for the graphics to be sent to us so we can use them. And these brochures you could see on the inside will be translated into Armenian, Korean, and Spanish. And we'll have those printed as well for customers that ask us to send it to them. We will be using this brochure as a bill insert as well as a handout at any of our community events and having them at public counters. The image that you see behind that, this is going to be our new advertising for our water conservation campaign. This currently is a static cling which goes on windows, walls, mirrors. So we're going to be distributing this to all restaurants, hotels, and any facility that has a public bathroom. We'll be distributing it to them in person and with a letter asking them if they'd like to order more, we'd provide that to them. We'll also be working with our restaurants to provide them with table tents for their restaurant tables, asking customers to ask for water instead of being served water when they come in. In the next few months, we will be attending over 15 public community events, including the Farmers Market in Montrose and Glendale, to share our conservation information. We are currently working with Metropolitan Water District on their messaging, and I'm not sure if you've heard, but they started their radio ads this past week to all Southern California radio. They're purchasing radio spots, and they're promoting water conservation and the local public utilities website for more information. We will also be working with the Glendale Unified School District to distribute information to students. And lastly, we have started our monthly multi-city meetings with Burbank, La Cañada, La Crescenta, the Foothill Municipal Water District of La Cañada, Pasadena, and South Pasadena, where we will discuss about messaging outreach, so we have a similar message going out to all the different communities. We will bring you more materials as they are developed. So at this time, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Yes, I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
I think General Manager Zorin mentioned that there will be a MWD meeting coming up, right? Historically, I think we've been buying approximately maybe 30%. Is that
70.
70%?
We buy 70%.
Wow, 70%. Okay, so now we're looking at a reduction, voluntary reduction of 20%. What sense do we have that we're going to be able to do that? And if not, what would be the consequences? Are we going to have water shortage rates? I mean, can you fill me in on that?
I think, Madam President Pro Tem, members of the Commission, we really, because we are so dependent on MWD, and MWD is the major driver of water supply here, is we go a lot by what they do. So at this point in time, what we have heard from them is that they are going to continue in the voluntary with the same 20% goal, and that their storage capacity is sufficient to last quite some time. Now, we'll continue to monitor that in relation to how much they charge us, because that could make a difference to us as a member agency. But we know what their 2-year rate plan is, and it is something that we've already built into our budget, so it doesn't look like that is going to be so cost prohibitive that we would have to do something drastic. So we're trying to get our folks to continue to voluntarily do more. I think Atine may have actual numbers, but our conservation efforts have paid off tremendously. We're consuming approximately the same water today as we did in 2006. And we've added a lot of meters since then, I'll tell you. So, people have gotten into the habit. It's just become part of what they do, which I think you've all heard and we've all heard many times. That's the only way we're going to survive this thing, because it's not going to be cyclical drought anymore. It's just a drought, and it is what it is, and our water is short. So we're going to have to adopt some of these habits, lifestyle changes when it comes to the use of water as a permanent part of our everyday existence. And I think a lot of our residents have already done that. So,
Right, they've already done that several years ago.
yeah,
So
and
now
then they've
it's
continued
additional.
that, which,
Right.
you sometimes worry that it's just, we went through a mandatory phase, lift the mandatory phase, and all of a sudden things go back to the way they were. But that's not the case. Now, we're not saving as much water as we did under the mandatory phase, but we certainly have seen it reach a lower use level than it was before, prior to that. So we know that some of these habits are settling in. So we'll continue to watch it really monthly. I mean, we have our folks in contact with them to see if there's any changes. There's a whole now debate about how do you deal with drought? Do you deal with it on conservation, or do you deal with it on storage? And so I think MWD, and to a certain extent the city of Glendale as well, because that's where we have spent a lot of money over the last several years, is our storage capabilities, is to have that water available in huge supplies to try to get you through these cyclical periods. But I'm not sure that's going to be enough. Mm-hmm. So we will continue to watch it. We, at this point in time, don't have any set time period of where we might kick in a mandatory phase. Certainly, if MWD were to do it, we'd have to look very seriously ourselves at countering with mandatory, going into our level 2, tier 2, as we move through our conservation categories. But at this point in time, we're going to continue to do our outreach and promote voluntary conservation and see where we go with that.
I remember we talked about the voluntary 20% reduction like a couple months ago or several months ago, right? Have we seen any results?
We can bring you those results, but yes, we like Steve said, we
You
have
have seen
had
a drop?
steady drop. Not as much as we went into mandatory, because then we had a 3-day-a-week watering schedule, and customers had to abide by that. But now it's just kind of the habits have set in, and we're seeing a consistent lower usage than we had before.
And we're entering the hotter season, so it's kind of hard to do comparisons in January and February when those are traditionally low water use months anyway. It's hard. So we'll continue to watch it as we get into the warmer weather, and there's a tendency for folks, especially when it comes to landscape maintenance, to use more water.
Okay. Well, yeah, it's great that there will be all these events where this message will be pushed to the public, and I assume it's all over your webpage, our webpage?
Yes.
Okay. All right, great. Questions?
Just wondered if maybe you could include pricing information, not just the number of gallons saved, in the brochure or the pamphlet, so that, saving 5 to 10 gallons per day by taking a 5-minute shower will save you $1.50 on your shower or something like that. So you actually include like an average kind of, because that puts it in, I think, more real terms for your customers in terms of what are you saving on your bill every time you do this.
Okay.
And then the other question I had was if GWP has done any kind of study on the impact of the effectiveness of the various methods of community outreach on some of these programs.
We definitely measure a lot of our outreach by the response that we get, definitely from the water conservation itself. Sure. If our customers are conserving. Obviously we know some outreach works better than others, such as like local public advertising in a newspaper isn't as effective as giving somebody a tips brochure, but definitely we will measure that. It's easier to measure with our social media, definitely, to see the number of customers responding and what they're doing. And also, as I come back to you to report on some of our activities, we'll see as we promote our Water 101 classes, which we will be having. I haven't discussed that yet because they're still in the works. But our participation in our programs, whether it's our rebates, our 101 classes, our landscape classes, and then we are in the process of designing a turf removal program. So we can also measure some of our program participation and what customers are doing to conserve with those.
And then my last thought is maybe you can include some kind of a sort of banner on the website, how much a gallon of water costs you. Okay. What does it cost to take a shower, and just have it kind of a rotating kind of, almost like a stock ticker of, what is an average water use cost a customer, something like that.
And certainly in another month or so, we're going to talk a lot about that. So.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next item, please.
4B, Energy Risk Management Update.
Madam President Pro Tem, members of the Commission, this is our, I want to say monthly, but it's probably going to end up being more quarterly as we get the information to you of our Internal Energy Risk Management Committee and some of the highlights of what we've talked about and what are some of the upcoming major issues. Lon Peters is here to go over what we've talked about in since our last update to you. I think we've met about 3 times, Lon, the committee.
Risk Management Committee
Yes.
on this, well, with respect to the revisions,
Just in
once.
June.
Yeah, we've only met once on those.
Go right ahead.
Thank you. Members of the Commission, Lon Peters, Integrated Resources Planning Administrator. How do I, well, you get a good shot of, there it is, the title slide. Okay. I'm here because in the current energy risk management policy, there is a requirement that the Risk Management Committee at least once a year look at the policy and see if any revisions are required. And so we started that process a few weeks ago with the Risk Management Committee, and I'm going to go over at a very high level, the changes that we are recommending to the committee, which would then be brought to you and to the City Council for review and hopefully adoption. So why are we doing this? Because of this pop-up menu that's standing here in front of me. Okay. There are changes in the markets that we've seen since the risk management policy was developed and implemented last spring. We now have a full year of carbon markets behind us. We can see how the carbon markets have changed energy prices in California and outside California, and therefore the kinds of trades that our trading floor folks might get involved in, might recommend, might need to implement in order to provide power supplies to the city in the lowest cost manner. Excuse me. And we've seen the RPS and CO2 regulations continue to change as well. And so we go back to the risk management policy and ask, is it currently working the way we would like it to in order to enable us to do the kinds of trades we'd like to do within the limits of the policy? So what we're focusing on is transaction limits. So these are the tables that lay out who is allowed to buy what, for how long, how far in advance, what kind of exposure, basically, cost exposure, could an individual transaction or set of transactions create for water and power customers. So we have 5 transaction limits table currently, one for power, one for gas, et cetera. That's on the second sub-bullet there. And these provide for each one of the products how long can the individual set up a transaction, how far in advance, how large can that transaction be, and what's the price limit that's associated with that transaction. And you'll find at the lower levels of the trading staff, they're much more severely constrained in what they can do. And then as we get to larger and larger transactions or to longer duration transactions, those move up the hierarchy internally for review and approval. One significant change is we have a single table right now that addresses both RECs and carbon allowances. We're seeing that we like to be able to transact in those products separately. So we're proposing to separate those out, not change the limits, not give anybody any more freedom to do what they're compared to what they're doing now, but to make it clear that when somebody's doing a transaction, the REC component fits inside these limits and the carbon component fits inside these limits. So it's easier to track, we think, over time. There are some general changes. The energy trading manager position itself did not make it into the current policy. So there's an individual who would normally be actually transacting on a daily basis who doesn't have any authorities at all. So we want to add that position back in. And then there are some differences between the way the trading limits were set up in the policy and the standard kinds of transactions we do in the market or that our real-time operator does on the weekends and especially on long weekends. So instead of referring to 4 months, we'd like to refer to standard quarters, 1 quarter, 2 quarter. And then ACES, our real-time operator, does take actions that on the weekends to make sure that loads and resources are in balance, and those actions can last for several days at a time, and currently they're restricted to 1 day. For natural gas and CAISO, there's some discrepancies between the limits in the policy and what we actually burn in the way of natural gas at Grayson and Magnolia. We'd like to get those limits in line with what our actual consumption tends to be. For the transactions that we might do with the California Independent System Operator, not that much volume, but there are some types of products we might want to trade in that are not referenced in the policy. For emissions, this table only refers to SO2 and NOx right now, and there are some aggregate limits that we think are covered, that is the total exposure to the city from a number of different types of transactions or a number of different transactions. We think those are covered by the prohibition on speculation. That is, in order to get to those large enough aggregate amounts, we would be speculating on what the future would be in terms of prices for these types of emissions rights, and that's not permitted by the prohibition on speculation in the policy. So we think that the aggregate limits are not necessary in this particular case. And then for these emissions rights, there are no authorities below city manager and general manager. I think that's a leftover from several years ago. We'd like to set up a structure for trading authorities below the general manager that mimics the limits on trading structure for the other commodities, and bring that back. For RECs, renewable energy credits, and carbon allowances, as I mentioned, these are now merged into one table, which makes it sometimes awkward to take a particular transaction and ask if it fits or not. We think if we separate these, it'll be a lot easier. There's also another product or compliance instrument, if you will, called an offset. We can use these potentially to meet our carbon obligations in the future. They're a lot less expensive than carbon allowances, but they carry different kinds of risks, and we would have to be looking at insurance products to go along with those if we wanted to buy those. We don't have any of those in our portfolio right now. But we'd like to make it explicit that those are allowed if we can find them and that they fit within risk parameters, because it would be a less expensive way of meeting our carbon allowances, carbon obligations. So the proposal here is that we come back to you next month with another report from the Risk Management Committee with a specific set of recommendations on changes, and that this then go to City Council in June, along with the annual trading authorization, which happens every year, typically in June, which dispenses with competitive bidding for certain types of energy transactions for 1 year at a time. And this would be effective then on the 1st of July, and then we would come back next year, if necessary, if we think that there are some changes that we think should be made. I'll be happy to answer any questions I can.
Yeah, first of all, I see that, so it's going to council, right, for approval.
Yes.
And is this mandated by anyone?
Is
our policy reviewed or approved, or is there any
I don't know what the mandates
state
are.
Is
Commissioner
there any
Chan,
state
no,
oversight?
there's not to our knowledge, there's no requirement. However, by the policy itself, there's a requirement for an annual review. So that's why we're undertaking this review.
Right. But the changes that we're proposing, other than the council, nobody else will be reviewing or have the ability to disapprove.
No, there won't be anyone else approving it.
Okay.
The policy actually incorporates other regulatory issues that we're dealing with. This isn't totally an internal policy that had been kind of pushed to the wayside. So what we wanted to do when I came over was to make sure we reviewed it every year, make sure we met regularly, reviewed it every year, and any changes that needed to be made, we'd make those. If there's no changes, we're still going to take it to council nonetheless, talk about it a little bit, let them remind them what it is that we do with this, and see if there's any direction they want from us.
Mm-hmm. Okay. The next question I have is, looking at the proposed changes at Energy Trading Manager, how many people actually have the ability to do all this right now?
Let's see, it starts off with a trader, goes to a term trader, energy trading manager, assistant, chief assistant general manager, city council.
Okay, okay, so 7. 6 or
7 layers.
7 layers, right. Okay. So, okay, for the slide 6, proposed changes for natural gas, we're suggesting to increase limits to meet GWP's expected consumption needs. How short have we been?
I would have to go back and find those numbers. I don't have them off the top of my head.
So for the proposed changes on emissions, so we're deleting the aggregate limits. That means our emissions will be higher.
No, this
Is there a chance?
I'm sorry, I wasn't clear. This is trading in emissions permits, not necessarily actual emissions.
Okay. Okay, the permits.
So it might be the case that we have the right. Typically, we don't trade in these instruments at all. We have limits on what we can do at the power plant that are set by license or by AQMD permits. We have limits on what we can do at Magnolia, also set by AQMD. So, to my knowledge, I've never actually seen one of these transactions go through. But we're trying to set up a structure that could be in place and be available if, in fact, it turns out we need to or propose to trade in some of these permits.
And that would be okay with AQMD?
Depending on the license, or sorry, depending on the air permit that we have. Right now, for example, with respect to NOx, we live under a cap, an annual cap of 35 tons per year for NOx at Grayson.
Mm-hmm.
We don't trade in that. It's not a tradable commodity. We can't go out on the market and sell those rights to somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
We just
Okay.
have to make sure we stay within them, that cap.
Okay. So this is very new. We've never really done this before then, what you're suggesting here.
Actually, I think this particular table is been there for several years and just not been implemented. That's my understanding.
Okay. And you think there's a chance that we may be implementing it?
It's possible if we think about potential futures for the power plant.
Mm-hmm.
We may need to change the way we operate in those markets.
Okay. So this bullet here, add authorities below city manager and general manager, and this is, what authority are you talking about?
Well, right now, for example, Mr. Lenz has no authority to trade at all.
Oh.
And the energy trading manager has no authority to trade at all. So what we would propose is to take the structure that's in place currently for the day trader and the term trader, et cetera, and recreate or create a structure for these emissions rights that has the same overall limits on financial exposure to the city. So if the day trader, for example, is only allowed to trade, it creates an exposure of, I'm going to pick a number, $25,000, we would try to mimic that in this trading limit table as well.
Okay. And everything that we're looking at and proposing all are within the AB 32 requirements, correct?
Everything, well, in this particular table doesn't go to AB 32, but the CO2 table would. And yes, these offsets are part of our of the instruments that we can use for compliance with AB 32,
Okay.
as well as allowances.
Okay. So with this slide, the proposed changes, RECs and CO2, split into separate tables. You're having the RECs for one table and the CO2 for in another table.
That's correct.
Okay. Okay, I have no other questions. Do you?
So I just want to sort of put the SO2 and NOx emissions limit expansion in kind of a context. So we're talking about using that for Grayson primarily, right? So I think one of the things that we would need to look at is sort of a asset depreciation schedule that factors in all-in costs, including the cost of the permits that we would need to get for SO2 and NOx. And really look hard at that sort of capital investment plan for replacing Grayson, because if it's the nature of these emissions regulations programs is to constrain that market and make it more and more expensive to pollute. And I think the legislature over time is just going to constrain that market even more. And we might want to think about making sort of an investment in the long-term power system portfolio that we want to see, which could include replacing Grayson. So I think when we come back with capital investments, that should also include air emissions permits and sort of the other side of the ledger, which is just cost to keep operating keep operating the plant as is. My other question is with regards to CO2 offsets. Who regulates the offsets? Who generates?
The California Air Resources Board.
So ARB does both the allowances and the offsets.
Correct.
So presumably some green project that is going to generate offsets would have to go to ARB and be certified that you are indeed generating those CO2 offsets. So that's where where an area of risk is. Maybe one of the things that we can bake into the policy is to require that any project that we would pursue for an offset has their ARB clearance. So that might mitigate our need for kind of an insurance-based project, so that we know that offsets are going to be generated from those things. I guess I don't understand the complete picture of the risk there, if you can elaborate on that.
Well, there's always a risk of some kind when you're dealing with a product that is regulated, such as renewable energy credits or carbon allowances or carbon offsets. And one of the risks is that several different types, but one is that the regulations could change over time.
Sure.
And we find this in the renewable energy markets, where we want to make sure that if we sign a 10-year contract, that energy is going to qualify as renewable for every second of every year for 10 years. In the case of offsets, there's a different type of a risk, but it's very similar. That is, we could sign a contract that says we're going to buy offsets from some project in Georgia. It has to be in the lower 48, I think. And 5 years in, the project could disappear, or the regulations could change and disallow that project. So one type of risk which we are always cognizant of and trying to mitigate in any of these is change of law, change of regulations. And we, of course, try to make sure that we've either mitigated that, covered that somehow ourselves, or we've put the risk back on the seller, who is then responsible for taking actions to stay in compliance with the terms of the contract.
And I think to the extent possible, putting that risk back on the person generating the offset is probably the preferred approach to wherever possible.
That's one way, and another way is there are emerging insurance markets.
Sure.
And that may be a less expensive way. I don't know yet. These are pretty immature markets.
Okay. All I got.
Okay. Next item, please.
Horse. Oh, actually, it's lawn.
Lawn, yeah.
I have another one.
Oh, okay.
I'm back.
Okay.
RBS compliance. And this has been a regular item for several commission meetings, I think. So today I'm going to, thank you, tell you where we've been and where we think we're going, near term and long term. This is a pie chart that you've seen before. This is the most recent one for calendar 2012. It only shows a snapshot for 1 year, but you get a general idea of where we are in terms of renewables. The one edit or change is
Excuse
that
me. I don't have this item on my agenda. I don't know if others are in the same position.
Christine,
Strategic
this is
plan
all.
outline?
This is the same committee update. These are just two of the key items the committee has looked at since then. So,
Excuse me.
Yeah, instead of breaking out the minutes and going verbatim on every single thing we talked about, which would be rather boring. We've decided to hit the high notes, and the two things were the policy update and then the RPS compliance.
Got it. I'm sorry for the interruption.
All right. Since this table was put together, we did send Los Angeles a notice that we would be declining the option on Milford 2, which is the little arrow in the top left corner of this chart. That's a wind project in Utah. We looked at the cost relative to our other options and decided just recently that this was much more expensive than we needed to spend for renewable energy. There's also a question over the long term of whether we would have transmission access from Utah to California to actually get that energy delivered. So that's gone.
So do we currently have 18.8%?
Well, I'll get into more details here about where we are. This is a slide you've seen before, although I just noticed before I stood up that there's a line missing. The RPS obligation in megawatt hours somehow got lost when this was put together. But this is, it shows you the structure of what we're working with. We finished compliance period 1, 2011 to 2013. We're now starting compliance period 2. And then we have a third compliance period, and then we have annual compliances periods after 2020. And you can see there with the dark purplish line, the percentage obligation climbs fairly steeply now toward that 33% target in 2020. So the next slide is, how did we finish the first compliance period? The 2011 to 2013 compliance period was an average obligation over 3 years of 20%. So we had, I think, 1 year or 2 years where we were below 20%, and then we caught up last year. We had an obligation over that 3-year period of about 640,000 RECs. We actually procured, bought on the market, bought from other suppliers, or generated ourselves at the Grayson plant using our landfill gas, about 670,000 megawatt hours. So we were over-procured. We were a little bit long, a little bit in surplus. And that's actually where we wanted to be, because the risk of falling short was the potential for paying a penalty. The risk of being long is not much, because we can save them and use them in the future. Now, there are restrictions on how we can save them and use them, but they are an asset, an intangible asset that we can carry over with limits. So we were aiming to be a little long, and that's where we were. Eventually, we have to develop a retirement strategy for these RECs, because they have to be retired within 36 months of being generated, and they can be retired into some future year. So taking a retirement action does not necessarily mean that the REC is retired the day we retire it. We can point to a future year and say, we want to meet an obligation in 2018 with a 2014 REC that we retire in 2017. So we have to figure out the algorithm that's going to give us the best value for this portfolio of RECs that we're building up. Now, so we finished compliance period 1. We're now looking at compliance period 2, where our obligations step up in the third of the 3 years. The total obligation is stepping up from about, 644 to a little over 700,000 in the current 3-year period. You can see how that's broken down. The big step up is in the third year. But again, we can over-procure this year if it looks economic, and save some and use them in 2016 to meet that step-up obligation in 2016. Our grandfathered resources, these are the resources that were online and running before the law was passed that made RPS mandatory for publicly owned utilities. They're expected to yield about 630,000 in this 3-year period. So we've got about 80,000 to make up over a 3-year period just to be in compliance right now. And some of this is going to be energy, and some of it's going to be probably tradable RECs, which are relatively pretty inexpensive. Some of it's going to be excess. So here's a very high-level strategy for compliance in this 3-year period. The T-RECs the tradable RECs, which are just certificates that we bought. Those cannot be banked for long term. So we want to retire those fairly soon and apply them to our obligations now. The same is true for short-term energy purchases, which cannot be rolled forward and banked, or certainly not for as long. There's a limit on how much we can buy in the way of T-RECs. So if you take the first two categories here, the short-term purchases and the T-RECs, you get to about 40,000, or about half of our obligation, our short position in the next 3-year period, in this current 3-year period. So we expect to be buying some energy, some additional renewable energy, product content category, or bucket 1 and bucket 2. The prices are relatively low right now. There were a number of utilities that actually significantly over-procured in the first compliance period, and they're out there looking to sell energy, now renewable energy, in the market. So it's a buyer's market. It's not like housing, at least in this part of the world. And whenever we import renewable energy to actually meet our loads, we avoid using up one of those free carbon allowances at the same time. So if we buy renewable energy for, say, $10 or $15 over market, and at the same time save a carbon allowance which has a value of, say, $6 over market, then we have we're actually we may be spending less than $10 over market to buy renewable energy on a short-term basis. So that's this compliance period. Long-term, we're considering several different types of strategies, and it might be we end up with a combination of all three. We can go out into the market. We can buy a month of renewable energy delivered to our loads, or 2 months, or 3 months, or 6 months. We can buy, and that would be, say, in the next few months, we could sign a contract today and have renewable energy delivered next year or the year after, a forward purchase. And the idea would be to take advantage of relatively inexpensive markets to build up some excess and then bank the grandfathered RECs that we're generating anyway and use those in future compliance periods because those have much longer term value. So that's the first general option. The second is we're looking at an asset inside of Glendale. We have landfill gas supplies at Shoal Canyon. They're very low quality right now, very low heat content, full of noxious stuff that we have to be careful about. We have an engineering firm from Pittsburgh coming in next week to start talking about cleaning that landfill gas up to the point where it's pipeline quality, which can now in California be injected into the pipeline because the law changed. And we could send it over, potentially send that landfill gas cleaned up to a biomethane level over to Magnolia and burn it at a much lower heat rate and get a lot more green megawatt hours out of that same supply of landfill gas. So we'll be looking at the feasibility, the engineering, and the costs and the potential benefits in terms of either selling the megawatt hours, green megawatt hours, to somebody else if it turns out the price is right, or just using them ourselves to meet our own compliance obligations. And then the third general category is an asset outside the city. This could be an existing solar facility out in the desert someplace where somebody, as I mentioned, has too much and wants to sell it and is willing to sell it for a pretty low price. Or it might be a brand new facility that has not yet been built. In any case, in all of these, there are many, many details to work out before we could make a specific recommendation or recommendations. That's the spectrum of things we're looking at.
You mentioned that there will be many things to be considered before you decide. What is the schedule? For the compliance 2, it's between 14 and 16. When do you need to decide for that period how we're going to make up the amount?
Well, actually, some decisions are being made. Some small, short-term decisions are being made. For example, energy that is, we need to meet load in the city in July of this year, for example, when we know when we're short. We actually need to import energy during those periods. We recently signed executed one confirmation for renewable energy during that month at a price that was lower than anything else we'd seen in a long time. So as we see a short position out there where we actually need the energy and we can fill it with renewable energy and save the carbon allowance and do so at a fairly low markup over market, we're doing those kinds of short-term transactions. The longer-term transactions are going to take more time to put together. But we might be able, for example, our physical short position in any given year is well in excess of 40,000 megawatt hours. We could just buy the energy we need to meet load from renewable supplies, renewable sources, as we're moving through each year and build the RECs up and use those to meet compliance obligations in 2016.
Those are the I'm so sorry. Those are the PCC1 and the PCC2.
Yes.
What do those stand for exactly?
Product content category.
Okay. Go ahead.
Thank you for the information. Question, so is that the going closer to a year at a time as opposed to building in longer-term contracts? Is that the more conservative approach from a cost perspective?
That's a kind of a hard question to answer because if we just stay short on the one hand and just say, we're only going to buy a month or 2 or 3 at a time, maybe up to a year, we run the risk that the market changes dramatically out there, and we don't have a hedge against that. We don't have a hard resource, for example, or a contract that protects us from a spike out there in the future. So we're always looking at that trade-off between staying short, going long, and trying to find something out there that looks reasonably attractive. It's not a whole lot more expensive than staying short, but it provides us some security out there in 2018, 2020, 2025, even farther. So it's a difficult balancing act, actually, between the two. And there are different risks associated with going long with a particular contract, particular supplier, particular solar facility that isn't built yet, that might be built, probably will be built, versus something that's already been built, and we know it's running, we know it's operating, we know it's performing. Will it perform for 10 years? Could we sign a contract for 10 years for that facility as opposed to the new facility? Those are the things we're exploring.
Okay, thank you.
With the asset in Glendale for the long-term compliance strategy, building the landfill gas to biomethane conversion project, how long will something like that take?
The engineering firm's doing what's called a phase 1 study. It's very short, 6 weeks, very high level financial and technical assessment. What equipment could we put at Shoal? What would we have to put at Grayson? Will it work with the existing pipeline because we don't want to dig the street up again? And where could we burn it? And how? So what's it going to cost? And if we pass that screen, and if it looks like it's financially a good idea, then there will be a much bigger decision about whether or not to spend a larger amount of money to do the very detailed engineering studies that would be sufficient to support either a bond sale for the capital equipment or a long-term sale to another entity who might want to buy the gas from us or buy the megawatt hours from us. Actual construction time for that is probably no more than a year. But there's permitting involved, there's financing, there's contracting. So probably from now, a couple of years before it's actually online. It might come online right about the time when our obligations step up in 2016.
And this has started already, right?
There's a two-pronged approach to this. This is part of our first efforts in the repowering of Grayson, but it also serves the purpose, obviously, of supporting our RPS requirements and solidifying our local asset here in Glendale.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Sounds good. Any other questions, comments?
last slide, not to make this any more complicated than it already is, but we're juggling not only options regarding RPS compliance, we're mixing those in, as Mr. Zern mentioned, with options for repowering Grayson, or maybe increasing our import capacity from Los Angeles. And these are all highly interrelated subjects.
Okay. We have no other questions. Thank you so much for the update.
Thank you.
Next item, please.
Madam President Pro Tem, members of the Commission, we've talked about our development of a strategic plan within the utility, and so we are coming back today to give you an update on where we're at. We've essentially set, in meeting with our staff, the managers, looking at other utilities and where they are going with this. There's a big change in the utility industry and how they're setting their strategic plans. So we've talked to several of those, and in the meantime, what we feel we've done is we've set the foundation for our plan. And plans are becoming much more direct, much less. They're not 400-page documents anymore. They're very quick hits, things that people can understand, both those who are working for us, who have to go out there and get the job done, but more importantly, our customers who are looking to see what our objectives and strategic goals are for the future. So Steve's going to go over where we're at today, and we continue to build on this. And our goal is to have our plan ready by the new fiscal year, which would be July 1. So that's what we're shooting for.
Madam President Pro Tem, members of the Commission, Steve Lenz, Chief Assistant General Manager for Glendale Water and Power. Over the past several meetings, we've received comments from the Commission on a strategic plan for Glendale Water and Power. So we've gone back and reviewed our old plan and put together what you should have in your packet, which is a draft strategic plan outline. And at this point, it really is just a plan outline. It's structured around 6 goal areas. Those areas are first, customer engagement and satisfaction, organization and structure. Then the next 3 are related to modernization, grid operations, modernization, power, water, and facilities, modernization, technology, and business systems. And then the final area is financial performance and business development. Now, each of these areas has goals, and you can see from the plan, we've tried to keep it simple. We've got the goals on the left side, and then key initiatives that will support those goals on the right side. I'd like to walk you through just maybe the first goal and initiative for each of these 6 areas to give you a sense of how the plan was structured. And then after I've done that, I want to let you know that we do intend to put together a dashboard with metrics and come back to you on a periodic basis to indicate progress on the various goals. We haven't determined exactly what those metrics are going to be, if they're going to be metrics related to a goal or key initiatives, and how detailed they'll be. But after we walk through this today, this is really just an initial introduction. We'd like to get your feedback on the way it's going, kind of the structure, and then maybe some ideas on what you would like the dashboard to look like and the level of detail you're interested in. So if I could just turn to the draft that you have, and I'll go through the first area, which is customer engagement and satisfaction. And you can see the first goal that we have there is to ensure that GWP is consistently in the top 25% of CMUA, that's California Municipal Utility Association utilities, in terms of customer value and satisfaction as measured by our annual CMUA surveys by June 2015. And I think you saw from the minutes, it was just last February, we went over some of those surveys, which indicated that we had some issues in those areas. So looking at just the first key initiative that will help us get there is to implement a mobile smartphone customer access to data by December 2015 and enroll 25% of our residential customer base by June 2017. And I don't want to go through all of these, but there's another long list of initiatives that we think will get us to those improved customer value and satisfaction metrics. So moving to the second area, which is organization and structure. You can see the first goal there is to develop an increasing capability for the organization to move beyond reactive and compartmentalized decision-making to planned, fact-based, nimble decision-making to achieve its strategic goals by June 19. And that's a fairly broad goal area. The first initiative that will move us towards that is to develop and implement an internal communications, training, and rewards program to educate all personnel on the goals of the strategic plan, how they fit into its realization, and to recognize individual efforts during implementation by June 2015. And once again, we're still working to refine some of these deadlines. In this case, June 2015 may be a little aggressive, but we're open to comment on all of those deadlines as well. And not just today, but between now and the next couple of meetings as well. We look for your input through email when you have time to sit down and actually go through this.
Before you move on,
Okay.
I have a question. With the strategic goals, the number one bullet here, development increased capability for the organization to move beyond, et cetera, by June 2019. What's the rationale for 2019? How did you come to 2019? That's like 5 years from now.
Well, we kind of reverse engineer from all these projects that we've got in the pipeline, and a lot of those projects relate to what we're doing with our technology, and they've got a long lead time. And so you can see if you read through the initiatives, and I think it will make more sense when you have time to sit down and really read through all the initiatives and look backward to those dates. There's a lot that we have to put in place, and we have to get these programs up and going. And we're talking that this first goal here is a big chunk of work when you're looking at putting in connected decision-making processes. For example, that includes things like our backbone for all of our technology that runs all of the technology through one system and connects the data to all the decision makers. That's going to take some time. So if you have specific questions on specific dates, we can certainly come back and fill you in on that. But that's the main rationale. Most of these dates are reverse engineered from mostly technology projects that we have in the pipeline that have come out of the work that we've done with the Department of Energy on AMI and modernization projects. So the third area, modernization grid operations. The first goal there, strategic goal, is to reduce the number of preventable outages to less than 25 per year by June 2015. The first initiative there is to fully implement electric and water meter data analytics program by December 2014. Some of these projects we're going to council, and we're already talking to vendors, for example, on a data analytics program. And then the OMS, DMS, or outage management system, distribution management system, we've done a lot of work on that, and we think that we will be getting that up and running by sometime in 2015. And so once again, we're reverse engineering from our initiatives into kind of our goal targets. Fourth area, modernization, power, water, and facilities. The first strategic goal listed there is to fully utilize the city's use of adjudicated water rights in the Verdugo water basin by December 17. And this, of course, is our right to groundwater. And as you've seen, it can be cheaper once you get the right wells in place and running at full volume to produce water from your local groundwater sources instead of buying it from MWD. And then the initiatives lay out a plan to get there and to meet some of the other goals as well. The fifth item is modernization, technology, and business systems. The first goal, the strategic goal in that area, is to ensure that all business and operational systems are interconnected through an enterprise-wide IT architecture by June 2019. And once again, this goes into the service bus, our enterprise service bus, which is going to take us a while to get up and running and get everything integrated into that system, which again is the reason why we've got this date out there at June 2019. Finally, we've got an area of financial performance and business development. The first goal there is to consistently be in the top 25% of APPA utilities of similar size and location as measured by the biannual APPA Performance Indicator Survey by June 2016. The first initiative listed here is implement a data warehouse and tools to use that warehouse. And this dovetails a little bit into the metrics that you've seen. You've seen the city KPIs for Glendale Water and Power. APPA has a set of KPIs that they put out for all of their member utilities across the entire nation, United States. And we are going to be looking at to what extent we put together, I think, a smaller list of KPIs. I know that Commissioner Camargo had talked about, Edison trying to get their KPIs down to maybe one sheet, maybe 20, 10 to 20 KPIs. So we're looking at potentially combining APPA utility-specific KPIs with some of the KPIs that we do for the city into a list that would be our KPI list and dashboard for the strategic plan. So I know there's a lot here, but I'd like you to take some time offline to take a look at it, send us questions. If you have specific questions, Madam President Pro Tem, for example, on some deadlines, get those to us, and I can meet with staff and make sure that we have detailed answers for you on all of those. But as I said, we'd like to get kind of just your feedback on the direction. As Mr. Zern said, we're trying to keep it simpler than our past plan. The past plan took us 9 months to put together, and we had extensive outreach both internally and externally. And we're just so lean now that we don't have the resources to dedicate to that type of effort. So we want to get what we think are the most important priorities down on paper and get some goals in place and start working towards those.
And as you mentioned earlier, you're working on establishing the dashboard and also the metrics to report at the current time, right?
Correct.
Okay. Yeah. So if we have any suggestions or questions, we'll email you.
Okay, great. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Nice work.
Thank you. Next item, please.
5, oral communication.
We have no oral communication at this point. Next item, please.
6, agenda forecast.
Okay, agenda forecast.
So, Madam President Pro Tem, members of the Commission, for next month, we've got 4 items there. Really, 2 of those are connected: the cost of service analysis and the water rate presentation and discussion. And like I have said before, that's likely going to take up the majority of our time. We also have in here the water supply and drought update, which we can, I think, give you should be pretty quick. And we have the awards, which will be pretty quick too, and I think it'd be nice to be able to do those. But the rest of the meeting will be dedicated to discussing the water rates, what we're proposing to do, agendas and schedules for going out to the community and our public outreach, and all the way to when we come back to commission again, and then finally go to council.
Okay, sounds good. I see a KPI update for June. Is that equivalent to the strategic plan update? What is that?
No,
that's different.
The KPI update is what we give you that mirrors, that's the council's KPI update.
Oh, okay.
And come back and show it to you as well to see where we were at for that period of time. It's a little difficult. We're trying to coordinate that because it all gets coordinated through the city manager's office. And so when that's done, it goes to council. Then we come to you the next meeting after and show you what the results were for GWP.
Okay.
So eventually we hope the KPI will be rolled into the strategic plan update, and you'll just get a single, probably quarterly update on our strategic plan, and we'll be able to dovetail the cities as a whole KPIs.
Right. Yeah, that's a good idea. So I understand our strategic plan is in the works right now. When should this be brought back to the commission again?
We'll probably bring it back to you at the July meeting, because June, we've got a couple of updates there that shouldn't take too long. Legislative update may take a little time, but we need to also talk about the budget, and so June is budget month. So I think we'll come back to you with the strategic plan in July.
Okay, sounds good.
And I think everything else for the time being, at least, is good where it's at, and if there's any change. Well, in July, we also have the rotation of the commission members, so the board positions.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So in May, the cost of service analysis, what's the level of risk that it's marked as tentative?
It has to be ready by the time we bring the
Okay.
presentation to you, so it'll be, the two will go together. It's tentative right now because it's still in draft form. But at the point in time when we come to you and publicly start to talk about the water rates, the COSA has to be complete, so.
Excellent.
Okay,
We're looking at budget presentation in June?
June.
Okay.
Likely because we've had to, actually the budget's not ready right now. I
Right.
mean, we're still working, and as you can imagine, it's tied pretty heavily to these water rates as well. So that could change the whole outlook of the budget. So we wanted to do the water rates, get those done. We had to unfortunately push that out a little bit because of just wanting to make sure we get it done right.
okay. No other questions? Next item?
7, adjournment.
So moved?
I'll say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Meeting adjourned. Thank you.